Welcome to Understanding the User. This is video 2, where we're going to talk about writing good interview questions. So in order to write questions, we need a context in which these questions are going to operate. So we need to set a design challenge and a design goal. We're going to use an example that we've talked about in class. So the design challenge is that current methods for tracking shopping lists, and here we're talking about grocery shopping, are time-consuming and cumbersome. Individuals forget paper lists or do not have them available when they think of an item to add. So the goal here is to develop a digital mobile solution that will efficiently support and manage grocery shopping for users. Your challenge right now is to pause this video and write out some areas of interest that will help guide you in writing interview questions. So you want to think about what are the kinds of things that you want to know about users in writing your questions. Please pause the video and do that now. Okay, so you should have gone away and wrote down some areas of interest. If you didn't do that, then I am like right now scolding you because you're a cheater. So when we think about what things we might need to write about, we think of these areas of interest. So things like, how do users manage their shopping? How satisfied are they with their current methods of grocery shopping or managing their lists or their needs? What are their priorities when they go grocery shopping? Do they prioritize selection or price? What do they think about? Who does the shopping? Does it vary? Where do they shop? What kinds of stores are they valuing and why? How often do they shop? What kinds of technology do they own? And how do they use that technology? If you're going to try and develop a digital solution, we really need to know what kinds of things these users are actually working with. So one thing to remember is that these are just areas to guide your questions. They're not the questions themselves. So it's not necessarily true that you're going to say, how often do you shop? That may or may not become a question. Or you won't say, how satisfied are you with your current methods? You'll ask a different kind of more rich question that will solicit conversation. But later on, when you've written your interview, you can look over your questions and make sure that you've written questions that address the areas that you think you need to understand in order to design an effective interface. So here are a list of do's. Do start broadly. As we talked about in the last video, you start with general understanding of context, perceptions, and values. So get very general and ask general questions about areas that are relevant to your design. Maybe how, in this case, how people go about their shopping, just in general. And let's hear their narrative before we start asking things that are more specific. Do you ask open-ended questions? So if your participant is only saying a few words, then we don't have a very good open-ended question. Do use questions that will solicit rich stories. We like to hear examples. We like to hear stories from their lives. Those give us often a lot of information about what they value and what they will need in a design. Ask about contrasting experiences and beliefs. So if you ask something positive, also ask about the flip side, the negative version. So for example, if you're asking, what are some of the successes you've had, then you'd ask about some of the failures as well. Change questions or follow up during the interview if you need immediate changes. These questions are not chiseled in stone tablets, and if you find things are not working, either in general or for a particular user, you can change them. The most important thing is that you get the best, most useful data that you can from these interviews. At the end of the interview, always ask about whether or not you can contact that user further if you have additional questions or additional things come up. This is a great way that you can do follow-ups if something happens and you need some additional information later. Some lists of don'ts. Do not ask yes or no questions. It's awfully tempting to write these, but they really don't give you much. There's no point in doing a user interview and soliciting rich conversation if all you're getting is a one-word answer from your participant. Do not ask leading questions or obvious ones. These are kind of like the mom and apple pie questions we talked about in the last video. So you wouldn't ask something like, would you like your calendar to be efficient? Or would you like your shopping list to keep you from forgetting things? Of course they would. obviously, because those are things that everybody would like and nobody would agree with the opposite. Do not ask the user speculative questions. So don't ask them if they would use particular things or specific features. They tend to think that in the realm of possibility, it's certainly possible that they would. So most answers to these tend to be positive. Don't ask the user to design the system. Don't ask them what this tool needs or what the system needs. They're not usually going to be able to articulate this. They're not the designer, you are. Do not use the word why in your questions or your follow-ups. This tends to make people very defensive. So for example, if you asked people, what was your favorite grocery store? And they named the grocery store and you said, why? It tends to make people think they need to justify their response rather than to explain it. So a good follow-up is instead to change it into what. So you can say, oh, well, what makes you say that? Or can you say more about that? These are fine follow-ups that keep people from getting too defensive. So right now we're going to think about how would we start about the interview. So we've said some do's and don'ts. We've talked in this video and the last video about starting broad and then getting more specific. So I want you to pause the video and write out the first 3 questions that you would ask for this context that we're using right now, this mobile grocery store list tool. Go ahead and pause and do that now. All right, did you do it or were you a cheater? I'm shaming you if you were. So how do you keep track of your grocery lists? Is that a good question or a bad question to start the interview? Well, let's think about that. It's pretty specific and it also makes some assumptions. It assumes that you use grocery lists, it assumes that you keep track of them, it assumes a certain position, and it's very specific. So we would say this is a bad way to start the interview. How about, we're designing a mobile grocery store app. What would it need to do to work for you? Also not a good start. So it's fine to give them a context that you're working with a certain stakeholder or you're approaching a certain kind of problem, but this is asking the user to design the interface, to design the feature, to design the app or tool. They don't know what they need. You need to figure out and understand how they work, how they operate, what their behaviors are, and then you as a designer are going to figure out what it needs to do to work for them. How about, do you keep a grocery list? Well, you may eventually want to find this out in the interviews, but is this a good question to start? Number 1, it's very specific, and it's also a yes or no question. So we would say this is not a good start. Starting the interview, remember we want to start very broad. So we might say something like, please tell me about how you do your grocery shopping. This is a very broad question that allows lots of diverse experiences. It allows for rich contexts and rich scenarios in that I'm probably going to tell you about some of my experiences. I'm also free to take this question in several different ways. That might seem like a disadvantage, but in this case it's actually an advantage. You're getting rich, useful data from your participants. How about things like, how do you decide what to buy? This is not assuming they use any particular method, any particular strategies, or even if they use a strategy at all. Somebody very well could answer this question like, well, I walk around with my cart and I just pick out stuff that looks good that day. It's not a very strategic response, but it's probably true to their situation in that case. This question allows for a large range of replies, which is exactly what you want when you're trying to understand your users. You could also say something like, please describe your grocery store visits during a typical week. You're just asking for their experience, for them to describe what their stories look like. And if needed, you could have some follow-ups. So, for example, when would you visit the store? Or what would be your purpose on each trip? This would be if maybe someone has trouble understanding that question or really doesn't give very much information like, my grocery store visits are pretty good. I go a couple times. And so you could find out when those would be, what they were doing. So having follow-ups that can be deployed if needed can often be a good thing for your interviews. You might have other questions, especially as you go further down and start narrowing more in on their particular behaviors and the kinds of things that you'll need to support. So how do you decide when you'll visit the store? Maybe please describe what makes a shopping trip successful from your point of view. If you're going to ask that positive, then remember we always ask the negative. So what would make a shopping trip frustrating or unsuccessful? What stores do you like best? This would certainly be fine if you're planning follow-ups to find out more about the kinds of features. So you'd say something like, what makes you like this store or these stores? Perhaps later, as you get further on in an interview, you do want to understand their technology use. You might say something like, if you own a cell phone, can you please describe what you have? You notice that this is not a yes or no question, and that we're not saying, do you own a cell phone? Which we're kind of assuming they do. In this day and age, you can probably assume that most of your users would actually own this kind of device. It also allows room for them to have their response, I don't have a cell phone, and that would be okay. So if you have this question and somebody says, well, they describe their cell phone, you might ask also about the most common ways that they use their phone. This might give you a sense of what kinds of apps and what kinds of interactions that they're used to taking with their phone. Some interviewing tips for you and your design teams are to interview as a team. Basically 2 people if you can. This is very helpful. One person gets to be the interviewer and one person gets to be scribing notes. Even if you are recording the session, there's lots of notes you can take about hand gestures, about really interesting things to look at specifically in the videos. And the interviewer has enough to do to try and track the responses, ask follow-up questions, be friendly and engaging. If they're trying to write down any notes or do anything like that at the same time, it's very, very difficult. So 2 people is always best if you can manage it. If you can't manage it and you have one person doing the interviewing, it's very helpful to, as soon as you are done with the interview, to sit down somewhere quiet, write down your impressions, write down the things that you find most interesting, and to make any notes about places to follow up in the video or things that won't appear in the video but that you thought were useful. Hand gestures, expressions, potential things that you saw in the office. So if you're interviewing someone in their office about organizational devices and you happen to notice things like filing systems that they didn't talk about, those are really helpful observations to go ahead and put in your notes. It's always good to explain and to start with explaining why you're talking to an interviewee. So make sure they understand what this is about without being too specific. So you might just say things like, we're designing a new tool for blah, in this case, a new tool for working with grocery stores and managing your shopping. And we just want to talk to you about your experiences and gather some information about the kinds of things that we should be doing. And it doesn't have to be very specific. A lot of times people will have known that once you've recruited them. They'll know kind of generally what this is about. It's helpful just to remind them. It's very important to explain that you'll keep all responses anonymous and then to actually do so. So usually we give pseudonyms to participants, so not their real name. Often we aggregate data if individual responses will sort of out a person. So you want to explain that you're going to keep all responses anonymous. People can worry that their responses might have negative impact on their jobs, or that they might be seen as anomalies and their responses will be really weird. So make sure that you're keeping everything anonymous. Explain that they can end the interview at any time for any reason. This is just a standard right of any participant in research, and so you want to make sure that they know this in case they do get uncomfortable or something happens. And look for opportunities to probe interesting responses. So if they say something interesting that you didn't expect, or that you weren't actually looking for but you think could be useful for your design, it's okay. You should talk about that. You should use that opportunity to gather as much data as you can from these people. So say things like, can you give me an example of that? Or can you say more about that? Or when you say this, what do you mean? So go ahead and gather as much data as you possibly can. And be sure to ask about how people already do relevant tasks. So for example, tell me about the last time you. Asking for those specific examples and those specific stories can be a great way to really get useful data from your participants. We'll talk in video 3 about some final objective methods for gathering user data. So that ends this video. So you should now do the self-check quiz in Canvas. And then finally, watch the last video about objective methods.